The wire cutters clicked through the night silence with deafening finality. The thick phone cable serving the isolated Montana cabin dropped lifeless to the forest floor. Seconds later, the main breaker on the utility pole was thrown, and the single light glowing in the second-story window, flickering alone amid the endless wilderness, died instantly. Marcus Razor Kellerman nodded with grim satisfaction. The intelligence was clean as mountain snow. A big house belonging to renowned biologists, dead in a plane crash last year. The old grandfather had left for Denver medical treatment a week ago. Inside, according to their informant, waited a safe containing insurance money and family heirlooms. Perfect work, quiet, quick, profitable. But Marcus and his partners had no idea that two pairs of eyes were already watching them from the darkness. Eyes that burned like molten gold, belonging to something that didn't bark, didn't growl warnings, something that simply waited with predatory patience for the right moment to defend what it loved most. What had they walked into, and would any of them survive the night? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 2 years ago, Emma Hartwell's world had shattered in the span of a single radio transmission. Small aircraft down in the Bitterroot Range, no survivors. Dr. James and Dr. Sarah Hartwell, Montana's most respected wildlife biologists, had been returning from a research expedition when their Cessna met an unexpected storm. At 15, Emma had lost not just her parents, but her entire universe. Her grandfather Samuel, a weathered rancher with kind eyes and arthritic hands, had moved into the family's remote cabin to care for her. For 18 months, they'd built a quiet life together. Emma pursuing her studies online while dreaming of veterinary school, Samuel sharing stories of the old days over evening cups of coffee. But 6 months ago, his failing heart had forced him into extended treatment in Denver, leaving Emma truly alone for the first time in her life, almost alone. 3 years earlier, when Emma was 14, she'd discovered a tiny, injured pup whimpering in a steel trap near Glacier Creek. Most people would have called animal control. Emma, raised by biologists who saw the sacred in every living creature, had instead cradled the wounded animal and carried him home. Her parents had been apprehensive. Genetic testing revealed the pup was 85% gray wolf, 15% German shepherd. But Emma's determination and the pup's gentle nature had won them over. She'd named him Shadow. Now fully grown, Shadow stood nearly 3 feet at the shoulder, his thick black coat gleaming like midnight water, his ice-blue eyes holding an intelligence that sometimes seemed almost human. He'd never shown aggression toward Emma or her family, but the townspeople of Cedar Falls whispered constantly about the dangerous animal living in the woods. 3 times, Sheriff Davidson had driven the winding mountain road to warn Emma about complaints. Hikers reported being stalked by a massive wolf. Mrs. Patterson's chickens had been killed, though Emma had immediately paid compensation and built a stronger fence. "One more complaint, Emma," Davidson had said just last week, his weathered face grim. "Just one more, and I won't be able to help you. State wildlife will come with tranquilizer guns, and that won't be a rescue mission." Emma understood. In a world where wild animals were seen as either commodities or threats, there was no place for a creature like Shadow. Too wild for civilization, too bonded to humans for the wilderness. He existed in a liminal space that made bureaucrats nervous and neighbors fearful. But for Emma, Shadow wasn't a problem to be solved. He was family, the only family she had left. Tonight, as autumn wind rattled the cabin's weathered boards and sent pine branches scratching against the windows, Emma sat at her desk completing an online biology assignment. Shadow lay curled on his favorite rug beside her bed, occasionally lifting his great head to gaze at her with those piercing blue eyes that seemed to hold all the loyalty and love in the world. Neither of them knew that three desperate men were approaching through the darkness, carrying tools and weapons, and the absolute certainty that the cabin held only a helpless teenage girl. They had no idea what they were about to unleash. Emma heard the splintering of wood downstairs and froze, her pencil suspended over her calculus homework. The sound was wrong. Not the familiar creak of old timber settling, but the deliberate crack of something being forced. Her ears, trained by years of living in wilderness isolation, immediately catalogued the noise. Window frame, probably the kitchen, definitely intentional. She didn't panic. Growing up as the daughter of wildlife researchers had taught her that panic killed more people than any predator ever could. Instead, she quietly closed her textbook and slipped from her chair, bare feet silent on the worn wooden floor. Shadow's head lifted immediately, his ears pricked forward in sharp attention. The voices drifted up through the floorboards, male, hushed, confident. At least two men, maybe three. Emma's mind raced through possibilities. Lost hikers didn't break windows. Game wardens announced themselves. These were intruders, and given the remote location and late hour, their intentions couldn't be good. Emma's first instinct was to call for help, but the landline had been dead for 20 minutes. She'd noticed when she tried to call her grandfather for their nightly check-in. Her cell phone showed no bars, as usual this deep in the mountains. She was truly alone, 15 miles from the nearest neighbor, with strangers moving through her house. Shadow rose silently from his rug, every muscle coiled with alertness. His nostrils flared as he tested the air, and a low rumble began deep in his chest, not the playful growl of their wrestling games, but something primal and dangerous. Emma placed her hand on his neck, feeling the tension thrumming through his powerful frame. "Quiet," she whispered, though she knew the command was unnecessary. Shadow's intelligence extended to reading situations with uncanny accuracy. He understood stealth as instinctively as breathing. Footsteps moved through the house below, accompanied by the harsh beam of flashlights cutting through darkness. Emma crept to her bedroom door and cracked it open, straining to hear their words. Exactly like he said. Big place, isolated. Old man's in the hospital, girls alone. The voice was gravelly, mature, carrying the weight of experience. "Where's the safe, Marcus?" A younger voice, impatient and rough around the edges. "We'll find it. These researcher types always have money stashed somewhere, insurance payouts, grant money. Just stay calm and do this right." Emma's blood chilled. They knew about her, knew her grandfather was gone, knew her parents had been researchers. This wasn't a random break-in. Someone had given them information, planned this invasion of her sanctuary. The footsteps were moving through the living room now, flashlight beams dancing across walls lined with her parents' research photographs, images of grizzly bears, mountain lions, and wolves. Wolves! Emma's heart hammered as she realized what would happen if these men discovered Shadow. They'd see him as either a threat to be eliminated or a valuable prize to be captured and sold. Neither option was acceptable. Shadow pressed against her leg, his body vibrating with controlled energy. His ice-blue eyes fixed on the bedroom door with laser intensity, and Emma could practically feel his readiness to explode into action. But action would mean violence, and violence would mean authorities, investigations, questions about why a teenage girl was living alone with what the state would certainly classify as a dangerous wild animal. The footsteps reached the bottom of the staircase. "Let's check upstairs. If there's a safe, it'll be in a bedroom or office." Marcus's voice carried clearly now. Emma had perhaps 30 seconds before they discovered her. Her mind raced through options, each worse than the last. Hide in the closet. They'd search every room. Try to escape through the window. The second-story drop would likely break her leg, and she wouldn't abandon Shadow anyway. Fight? She was 17 years old against multiple adult men. But as the first footstep creaked on the bottom stair, Emma realized she had one advantage these intruders couldn't possibly anticipate. They expected to find a helpless, frightened teenage girl. They had no idea that she lived with 120 pounds of apex predator who would die before letting anyone harm her. Shadow moved to the door, his massive frame blocking the entrance. His hackles rose, creating a dramatic silhouette that spoke of barely contained power. In the dim light filtering through her curtains, he looked less like a pet and more like what he truly was. A creature descended from wolves who had ruled these mountains for millennia. Emma took a shaky breath and made her decision. She would go downstairs and face these men, try to convince them to leave peacefully. She would protect Shadow's secret for as long as possible. But if they threatened her, if they forced her hand, she would discover exactly how far her bond with Shadow truly extended. The footsteps continued climbing toward her room, accompanied by harsh whispers and the metallic click of what sounded disturbingly like weapons being readied. The bedroom door burst open without ceremony, revealing two men silhouetted against the hallway darkness. The first was tall and lean, maybe mid-40s, with graying hair and the controlled movements of someone accustomed to violence. The second was younger, stockier, with nervous energy radiating from his hunched shoulders. Both carried flashlights that immediately swept across Emma's room, and both froze when their beams illuminated something they hadn't expected. Shadow stood perfectly still beside Emma's bed, his massive frame catching the light like a dark monument. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The men's flashlights trembled slightly as they took in the creature before them. Far too large to be a dog, too composed to be wild, too present to be ignored. "Jesus Christ," the younger man whispered, his hand immediately moving toward something at his waist. "Marcus, that's a goddamn wolf." Marcus, the older one, extended his arm to stop his partner's motion. His eyes never left Shadow, studying the animal with the careful attention of someone who understood predators. "Easy, Jake. Nobody moves until we figure out what we're dealing with here." Emma stepped into the light, her chin raised despite her racing heart. She'd learned from her parents that confidence, even when feigned, could determine survival in dangerous situations. "You're in my house," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You need to leave. Now." Jake's laugh held no humor. "Oh, we will, sweetheart. Right after you show us where Mommy and Daddy kept their money. But first, you're going to put that monster on a leash or—" "He's not a monster," Emma interrupted, moving slightly closer to Shadow. The wolf dog's ears flicked at her voice, but he remained motionless, every muscle coiled with potential energy. "And he doesn't need a leash. He stays with me because he chooses to." Marcus studied this tableau, the teenage girl and the massive animal that obeyed her without visible commands, and his expression shifted from surprise to calculation. "Interesting dynamic you two have," he said slowly. "Very interesting. Jake, put the gun away. I think our young friend here is going to be very cooperative." "Like hell I am," Emma shot back. But even as she said it, she understood the terrible logic of their position. They held her safety hostage. She held Shadow's behavior in check. It was a balance of mutual destruction that could tip into violence at any moment. Shadow seemed to sense the tension escalating. A low rumble began deep in his chest, not quite a growl, but a sound that spoke of barely restrained power. His ice-blue eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made the older man take an involuntary step backward. "Here's how this works," Marcus said, regaining his composure. "You're going to take us through this house, room by room, until we find what we came for, your companion, is going to stay calm and quiet. Because if he doesn't, if he so much as snaps at one of us, Jake here is going to put 3 bullets in him before you can blink." The threat hit Emma like a physical blow. She knew Jake meant it. She could see the fear-fueled aggression in his eyes, the way his hand hovered near his weapon. But she also knew something these men couldn't possibly understand. Shadow wasn't just protecting her. She was protecting him. "There's no safe," she lied smoothly. "My parents were researchers, not business people. We don't have the kind of money you're looking for." Jake's face flushed with anger. "Bullshit. Our information says otherwise. Big insurance payout, research grants, family money. Don't play games with us, kid." Emma's mind raced. Someone had fed these men detailed information about her family, her situation, even her grandfather's absence. This wasn't random. It was planned, targeted, personal. But who would want to hurt her enough to send armed criminals to her home? "Fine," she said, making a show of reluctant cooperation. "I'll show you around. But Shadow comes with me. If I try to leave him behind, he'll tear through that door in about 3 seconds." Marcus nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But understand, one wrong move from either of you, and this ends badly for both of you." They began a tense procession through the house. Emma led, hyper-aware of every creaking floorboard and shifting shadow. Behind her walked Marcus, his flashlight creating a pool of harsh light that made everything beyond it seem darker and more threatening. Jake brought up the rear, his nervous breathing audible in the silence. And beside Emma, matching her pace with fluid grace, padded Shadow. He moved like liquid darkness, his attention constantly shifting between the men behind them and potential escape routes ahead. Emma could feel the coiled energy in him, the predator's patience that could explode into action in milliseconds. They searched the living room first, Marcus directing Jake to check behind picture frames and inside cabinets while Emma stood in the center of the room, Shadow pressed against her leg. The familiar space felt violated by their presence. Her parents' carefully arranged research materials and family photographs suddenly seeming vulnerable and precious under the stranger's rough handling. "Nothing here," Jake muttered, kicking at a stack of wildlife journals with unnecessary force. "Keep looking," Marcus ordered, but Emma could see doubt creeping into his expression. The house, while comfortable, didn't show signs of the wealth their informant had promised. Everything was well made but practical, the home of people who valued knowledge over luxury. They moved to her parents' bedroom next, then her grandfather's study. Emma watched them rifle through decades of research, personal letters, and family memories with growing anger. These weren't just burglars. They were defiling her family's legacy, treating her parents' life work as potential hiding places for imaginary treasure. Throughout it all, Shadow remained perfectly controlled, but Emma could feel his tension building. His loyalty to her was absolute, but his instincts were screaming warnings about the threat these men represented. She knew that balance couldn't hold much longer. Finally, Jake's frustration boiled over. "Where is it?" he snarled, grabbing Emma's arm. "Stop wasting our time and show us the real hiding place." The moment his fingers touched her, everything changed. Shadow's rumble became a snarl that filled the room like thunder, and Jake found himself staring into eyes that promised death if he moved another inch. Jake's hand snapped away from Emma's arm as if he'd touched molten steel. Shadow had moved so fast that none of them had seen it happen. One moment he was standing calmly beside Emma, the next he was positioned between her and Jake, his massive frame radiating lethal intent. The transformation was complete and terrifying, from companion animal to apex predator in the space of a heartbeat. "Easy," Marcus said, his voice carefully controlled. "Everyone just stay calm." But Jake was past calm. The snarl that rumbled from Shadow's throat spoke to something primitive in the young man's brain, some ancestral memory of when humans were prey and creatures like this ruled the darkness. His hand moved instinctively toward his gun. "Don't," Emma said sharply, not to Jake but to Shadow. The wolf dog's ears flicked at her voice, though his eyes never left the threat. "He's not worth it." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus studied Emma with new respect, recognizing the steel beneath her teenage exterior. This wasn't a helpless victim. This was someone who had learned to live by the rules of the wilderness, where strength and intelligence mattered more than age or size. "You know what?" Marcus said finally. "Let's try a different approach. Emma, that is your name, right? Why don't you tell us about this house? About your parents' work? Maybe help us understand what we're really looking for." Emma met his gaze steadily. She could see the calculation in his eyes, the predatory patience that reminded her uncomfortably of Shadow himself. This man was dangerous in ways that went beyond simple violence. He was smart, experienced, and desperate enough to break into an isolated home. That combination made him more unpredictable than any wild animal. "My parents studied wildlife behavior," she said carefully. "Specifically, the reintegration of apex predators into established ecosystems. They spent 15 years documenting how wolves, bears, and mountain lions adapted to human encroachment on their territory." "And they made good money doing this research?" Marcus asked. Emma shrugged. "They got grants, government funding, sometimes private conservation groups, enough to maintain this research station and fund their field work. But we're not talking about millions of dollars here. More like enough to keep us comfortable and the research going." Jake shifted impatiently. "This is bullshit, Marcus. Our guy said there was serious money here. Insurance payouts, family inheritance, the works." "Maybe your guy was wrong," Emma said. "Or maybe he was lying." Marcus's expression darkened. "Billy Chen doesn't lie to me, not if he wants to keep breathing." The name meant nothing to Emma, but she filed it away. Billy Chen, whoever he was, had provided the information that brought these men to her door. Someone would need to answer for that if she survived the night. "Look around you," Emma continued, gesturing to the rustic but modest furnishings. "Does this look like the home of millionaires? My parents drove a 15-year-old pickup truck and bought their clothes at the outlet store in Kalispell. The most expensive thing in this house is probably my dad's microscope." Shadow had relaxed slightly, but his attention remained focused on the two men. Emma could feel his readiness through their bond, not psychic connection, nothing supernatural, but the kind of communication that developed between predator and pack after years of absolute trust. He would follow her lead, but he was prepared for violence if it became necessary. Marcus walked to the window and peered out at the darkness beyond. "Remote location, no neighbors for miles, phone lines cut, power out. You understand the position you're in, don't you?" "I understand that you're trespassing on private property and threatening a minor," Emma replied. "I also understand that you're about to leave empty-handed unless you find something that doesn't exist." Jake laughed bitterly. "You're awfully confident for someone whose life depends on keeping that animal calm." "Shadow doesn't need to stay calm," Emma said quietly. "He just needs to stay smart. And he's very, very smart." As if to emphasize her point, Shadow moved with deliberate purpose to a position that gave him clear sight lines to both men while keeping Emma behind him. It was a tactical positioning that spoke to intelligence far beyond simple animal instinct. Marcus noticed the movement and nodded appreciatively. "Impressive. How long have you had him?" 3 years, Emma answered, seeing no harm in the truth. "I found him injured when he was just a pup. My parents helped me nurse him back to health." "And the authorities? They know about him?" Emma hesitated. This was dangerous ground. He's registered as a wolf-dog hybrid. Perfectly legal in Montana with the proper permits. It wasn't entirely true. The permits were complex, and Shadow's wolf percentage was higher than most local regulations allowed, but it was close enough to truth to be believable. Still, Marcus mused, I imagine there are people who would pay handsomely for an animal like that. Collectors, private zoos, research facilities might be more valuable than whatever cash your parents left behind. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Emma felt something cold settle in her stomach. These men weren't just here for money. They were adaptable, willing to take whatever held value. And to certain people, Shadow would indeed be priceless. He wouldn't survive captivity, she said firmly. Animals like Shadow bond with one person, one family. Remove him from his environment, from me, and he'll either die of stress or become genuinely dangerous. Maybe, Marcus agreed. Or maybe he just needs the right kind of training. The casual cruelty in his voice made Emma's hands clench into fists. She'd heard stories about what happened to wolves and wolf dogs who ended up in private collections, constant confinement, minimal human contact, eventual madness from isolation and boredom. The thought of Shadow suffering that fate was unbearable. There's another option, she said, her voice carefully neutral. You could just leave. Walk away right now and nobody gets hurt. Nobody calls the police. You go your way, we go ours. Jake snorted. Right, and trust you not to call the cops the minute we're out of sight? With what phone? Emma gestured toward the dead landline. And my cell doesn't work out here anyway. By the time I could contact anyone, you'd be long gone. Marcus was studying her again, and Emma could see him weighing options. She pressed her advantage. Look, you came here expecting easy money from a rich family. Instead, you found a broke teenager with a dangerous animal. Cut your losses. There are plenty of other targets that won't fight back. She's got a point, Jake said, though he sounded reluctant to admit it. This is turning into more trouble than it's worth. But Marcus shook his head. We can't leave empty-handed. Billy Chen owes me big for this bad intel, but that doesn't solve our immediate problem. We came here needing money, and we're not leaving without it. He turned back to Emma. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to show us every hiding place in this house. Every loose floorboard, every false panel, every place your parents might have stashed emergency cash or valuable items. Because I guarantee you they didn't put all their money in banks. People who live this far from civilization always keep some resources close at hand. Emma's heart sank because she knew he was right. There was a hidden compartment behind one of the bookshelves in her father's study. Not a safe exactly, but a secure space where her parents had kept important documents, some emergency cash, and her mother's jewelry. Not enough to satisfy these men's expectations, but enough to make them dangerous if they discovered it. She could continue lying, claim ignorance, but Marcus was too experienced to be fooled indefinitely. Eventually, he would threaten Shadow directly, and then she would have no choice but to cooperate. Fine, she said finally. But if I show you what you want to see, you leave immediately after. No harm to me, no harm to Shadow. Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. That depends on what you show us, doesn't it? They began their search again, this time with Emma reluctantly pointing out the few places her parents had actually concealed items of value. A coffee can behind the water heater containing $300 in emergency cash. A small box in her mother's dresser with some modest jewelry, nothing expensive but pieces with sentimental value that had been in the family for generations. Jake grew more frustrated with each disappointing discovery. This is chicken feed. Where's the real money? There is no real money, Emma insisted. This is it. This is everything of value in the house. But even as she said it, she knew there was one more place they would inevitably discover. Her father's study contained not just books and research materials, but also the hidden compartment where the family's most important documents were stored: birth certificates, insurance policies, her parents' wills, and yes, about $5,000 in cash that was meant to cover emergencies until her grandfather returned. $5,000 wasn't the fortune these men had expected, but it was enough to make them feel the trip hadn't been completely wasted. It was also every penny Emma had in the world. Shadow had remained close throughout their renewed search, his attention constantly shifting between the two men and the various exit routes from each room. Emma could sense his growing unease. He understood that prolonging this encounter increased the danger to both of them, but he also seemed to recognize that rushing toward confrontation might have even worse consequences. As they approached her father's study, the final room they hadn't thoroughly searched, Emma felt the weight of inevitable discovery settling over her. Once these men found the hidden compartment and its contents, they would have what they came for. But would they really leave her unharmed? Would they risk her calling the authorities once they were gone? She was beginning to understand that this encounter could only end in one of two ways. Either these men would leave her alive to potentially identify them later, or they would ensure she never had the chance to talk to anyone about tonight. The study door stood open ahead of them, and Emma knew that whatever happened next would determine whether she and Shadow survived until dawn. The study felt different from the other rooms, heavier somehow, saturated with years of her parents' intellectual passion. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, packed with research journals, field guides, and academic texts on wildlife behavior. Her father's desk sat in the center, still scattered with the papers he'd been reviewing before that final, fatal flight. Emma's throat tightened as she stepped into the space that still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco and her mother's jasmine tea. Marcus moved through the room with professional efficiency, his flashlight beam probing corners and examining the wall construction. Jake began pulling books from shelves, shaking them to see if anything fell out, his frustration mounting with each fruitless search. "Careful," Emma said sharply when Jake roughly handled one of her mother's first-edition field guides. "Those books are worth more than anything else you'll find here." "Yeah?" Jake sneered. "How much?" "To the right collector. That Peterson guide is probably worth $800. The Audubon prints in that portfolio are worth several thousand." Marcus's head snapped up with interest. "Several thousand? For bird pictures?" Emma nodded, realizing she might have just bought herself some negotiating room. "Original Audubon prints are incredibly valuable. My mother collected them over 20 years, always dreaming of having enough to donate to the Smithsonian." Jake was already rifling through the leather portfolio, his rough handling making Emma wince. "These old drawings, they look like something out of a kid's book." "They're hand-colored lithographs from the 1840s, Emma explained, watching him hold a priceless great blue heron print by its corners. "That one you're touching is probably worth $1,500 in good condition, which it was until you put your fingerprints all over it." Marcus studied the prints with growing interest. Unlike Jake, he seemed to understand that value came in many forms. Portable, valuable, hard to trace, these might actually be better than cash. "They're also my mother's legacy," Emma said quietly. "She spent decades collecting them. They were going to fund my college education." "Were" being the operative phrase, Marcus replied without sympathy. He turned back to his examination of the room's structure, running his hands along the wall panels behind the bookshelves. Shadow had positioned himself near the doorway, effectively blocking the only exit while maintaining sight lines to both men. His behavior had grown increasingly tense as the search dragged on, and Emma could see the stress building in the rigid set of his shoulders and the constant swivel of his ears tracking every sound. Marcus paused at the bookshelf containing her parents' most treasured volumes, first editions of Aldo Leopold, Rachel Carson, and Jane Goodall. His fingers traced the edge of one section, and Emma's heart sank as she watched him discover what her father had hoped would remain hidden forever. "Well, well," Marcus murmured, applying pressure to a seemingly innocent piece of trim. "What do we have here?" The hidden panel swung open with a soft click, revealing a cavity about the size of a shoebox. Inside, clearly visible in his flashlight beam, were neat stacks of documents, a small wooden box, and several rubber-banded bundles of cash. Jake whooped with triumph. "Finally! I knew these research types had money stashed somewhere." Emma watched helplessly as Marcus began removing items from the compartment. The documents first: insurance policies, birth certificates, her parents' wills, and the deed to the property. Then the wooden box, which Emma knew contained her grandmother's engagement ring, her mother's pearl necklace, and a few other pieces of family jewelry, not expensive, but irreplaceable. Finally, the cash. $5,340 in various bills, rubber-banded in groups of 500. Emma's entire security net, carefully saved by her parents for emergencies exactly like this one. "Now we're talking," Jake said, reaching for the money. Marcus caught his wrist. "Not yet. Let's see what else our young friend might be hiding." He turned to Emma, his expression coldly satisfied. "You lied to me. You said there was no money." "I said there was no fortune," Emma corrected. "That's $5,000. Hardly the millions your informant promised." "5,000 is better than nothing," Marcus replied. "But I'm wondering what else you've been less than truthful about." He began examining the documents, his flashlight beam moving across official letterheads and legal language. Emma watched his expression change as he read, confusion replacing satisfaction. "Life insurance policy," he muttered. "Payable too." He looked up at Emma. "Where's the beneficiary payout? This policy is worth $200,000. Emma's stomach clenched. She'd hoped he wouldn't understand the paperwork, but Marcus was clearly more intelligent than she'd given him credit for. "The insurance money went into a trust," she explained reluctantly. "I can't access it until I turn 21 and only for specific purposes. College tuition, medical expenses, property maintenance." "Who controls the trust?" "My grandfather, and after him, the family attorney in Missoula." Marcus set the papers aside and opened the wooden jewelry box. The contents were modest but clearly well cared for. A few rings, a string of pearls, some vintage brooches that had belonged to Emma's great-grandmother. "Antique jewelry," he mused. "Could be worth something to the right buyer." "They're family heirlooms," Emma protested, her composure finally beginning to crack. "My grandmother's engagement ring, my mother's pearls." "You can't just—" "I can do whatever I want," Marcus cut her off. "You seem to forget that you're not in a position to negotiate." Shadow sensed the shift in Emma's emotional state and moved closer, his massive frame pressing against her leg in a gesture of comfort and support. The contact helped steady her, but it also drew Jake's attention. "You know what?" Jake said, his voice taking on an ugly tone. "I'm getting real tired of pretending that thing isn't a threat. Maybe we should deal with it before it decides to get aggressive." "Touch him, and you'll regret it," Emma said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Jake laughed. "You're gonna stop me? You and what army, little girl?" "She doesn't need an army," Marcus said thoughtfully, studying the interaction between Emma and Shadow. "She's got something better. Tell me, Emma, what exactly is that animal's training? Because everything I've observed tells me he's not just a pet." Emma remained silent, recognizing the trap in his question. Any answer would reveal either Shadow's lack of formal training, making him seem unpredictable and dangerous, or his specialized capabilities, which might make Marcus see him as even more valuable. "The strong silent treatment?" Marcus shrugged. "Fine. But here's what I think. I think your parents didn't just study wolves. They raised one. Probably illegally, definitely dangerously. And I think you've been living out here with a weapon that most people can't even imagine." He pocketed the cash and closed the jewelry box. "Jake, Pack up those prints. Handle them carefully. If they're really worth what she says, we don't want to damage our merchandise." "You're stealing my entire inheritance," Emma said, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. "That money was meant to keep me alive until my grandfather gets back." "Those jewelry pieces are all I have left of my family." "Should have thought of that before you lied to us," Marcus replied. "Besides, look at it as a life lesson. The world isn't fair, and sometimes bad things happen to good people. Your parents learned that lesson when their plane went down. Now it's your turn." The casual cruelty of his words hit Emma like a physical blow. This wasn't just theft. It was deliberate psychological torture designed to break her spirit and ensure her compliance. She felt anger building in her chest, hot and dangerous. Shadow felt it too. His rumble returned, deeper now, vibrating through the floorboards. His ice-blue eyes fixed on Marcus with predatory intensity, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Emma saw genuine fear flicker across the older man's face. "That's far enough," Marcus said, his hand moving toward his gun. "Call him off. He's not attacking anyone," Emma replied, though she could feel Shadow's readiness to explode into violence. "He's just responding to the emotional atmosphere in the room. Wolves are very sensitive to stress and aggression." "Then I suggest you de-stress the situation," Marcus said. "Because if that animal makes one aggressive move, Jake's going to put him down, and then we're going to have a very different conversation about your future." Emma understood the implicit threat. Without Shadow, she would be completely helpless against these two men. They could do whatever they wanted to her, take whatever they pleased, and leave her alive or dead, depending entirely on their whims. But she also understood something Marcus didn't. Shadow wasn't just her protector, he was her family. The bond between them went deeper than training or obedience. It was pack loyalty, forged through 3 years of absolute trust and mutual dependence. If these men hurt Shadow, Emma would find a way to make them pay for it. She might be 17 years old and physically outmatched, but she had learned survival skills from the best teachers in the world, the wilderness itself and the apex predators who ruled it. The standoff stretched taut as wire. 4 beings locked in a dance of dominance and submission, predator and prey. Outside, the Montana wind howled through the pine trees, carrying with it the promise of a storm that would make escape even more difficult. And in the distance, barely audible over the wind, came the sound of a vehicle engine laboring up the mountain road. The sound of the approaching engine cut through the tense silence like a blade. All 4 occupants of the study froze, heads turning toward the windows as headlight beams swept across the pine trees outside. Emma's heart leaped with desperate hope. Someone was coming. Help was arriving. But Marcus's reaction crushed that hope before it could fully form. His face darkened with murderous intent as he grabbed Emma's arm, yanking her against him while pressing his gun to her temple. "Who is that?" he hissed into her ear. "Who knows you're here alone?" "I don't know," Emma gasped, the cold metal of the gun barrel making her skin crawl. "Maybe my grandfather came back early from the hospital. Maybe it's Sheriff Davidson doing a welfare check." "Bullshit," Jake snarled, moving to the window and peering through the curtains. "You called someone. You warned them somehow." "With what phone?" Emma shot back, her voice strained by the arm pressed against her throat. "You cut the landlines, remember? And there's no cell service up here." Shadow had exploded into full alert mode at the sight of Marcus grabbing Emma. His rumble became a bone-deep snarl that filled the room, his lips pulling back to reveal teeth that looked capable of crushing bone. Every muscle in his powerful frame was coiled for attack, held back only by years of discipline and his absolute trust in Emma's judgment. "Call him off!" Marcus barked, pressing the gun harder against Emma's skull. "Right now, or I'll paint these walls with your brains." "Shadow, hold," Emma managed, though the word came out strangled. The wolf-dog's snarl didn't diminish, but he held his position, his entire being focused on the man threatening his pack leader. The vehicle outside was getting closer, its engine now clearly audible over the wind. Jake peered through the curtains again, his face pale with panic. "It's an old pickup truck," he reported. "Can't see who's driving, but they're definitely coming here." "Could be anyone," Marcus muttered, his mind racing through possibilities. Neighbor checking on the noise. Delivery driver. Hell, could be a lost tourist. "Or it could be the cops," Jake said, his voice climbing toward hysteria. "What if she did call them somehow? What if this whole thing is a setup?" Emma felt Marcus's grip tighten as his desperation grew. Desperate men made stupid choices, and stupid choices in a hostage situation usually meant people died. She needed to de-escalate this before panic drove him to pull the trigger. "Look," she said as calmly as she could manage with a gun to her head. "If I had any way to call for help, don't you think I would have done it hours ago? Whoever that is, they're not here because of anything I did." The truck's engine grew louder, then began to slow as it approached the cabin. Through the study window they could see headlights sweeping across the front yard, illuminating the outdoor furniture her parents had built by hand and the bird feeders that still attracted chickadees and nuthatches every morning. "They're stopping," Jake whispered, his voice tight with fear. Marcus's breathing had become shallow and rapid against Emma's ear. She could feel sweat from his palm where it gripped her shoulder, could smell the acrid scent of adrenaline and desperation. He was losing control, and when men like Marcus lost control, violence followed inevitably. Outside, a truck door slammed shut. Footsteps crunched across the gravel driveway, slow and deliberate. Then came a voice, weathered and familiar, calling out into the night. "Emma? You there, sweetheart? Saw the power was out and wanted to make sure you were okay." Emma's heart nearly stopped. That voice belonged to Walt Patterson, her nearest neighbor and one of the few people who knew she lived alone. Walt was 73 years old, arthritic, and completely unprepared for what he was walking into. "Friend of yours?" Marcus whispered, his tone making it clear that Walt's life now hung by the same thread as Emma's. "He's just a neighbor," Emma breathed. "An old man who checks on me sometimes. He doesn't know anything. He's not a threat to you." "Everyone's a threat now," Marcus replied grimly. Walt's footsteps moved across the front porch. They could hear him trying the door, finding it locked, then knocking with increasing concern. "Emma? Your truck's here, but the house is dark. Are you hurt? Should I call Sheriff Davidson?" Jake looked at Marcus with wild eyes. "We got to get out of here. If that old man calls the cops—" "Shut up and let me think," Marcus snapped, but there wasn't time to think. Walt's knocking became more insistent, and they could hear him moving around the porch, probably looking for another way in or checking the windows for signs of what might be wrong. That's when Shadow made his decision. The massive wolf dog had been watching the interaction with predatory intelligence, reading the body language and tension levels of everyone in the room. He understood pack dynamics better than most humans understood politics, and he recognized that the current situation was unsustainable. Someone was going to die unless something changed, and his pack leader was in immediate mortal danger. With no warning except a barely audible intake of breath, Shadow launched himself across the room. He didn't attack Marcus directly. That would have risked Emma being hurt in the struggle. Instead, with the calculating precision of an apex predator, he targeted Jake, who stood nearest to the window with his gun drawn but not immediately aimed at Emma. 120 pounds of muscle and bone hit Jake in the chest, driving him backward into the bookshelf with bone-crushing force. Books cascaded down around them as Jake screamed, a sound of pure terror that cut through the night like a siren. His gun went flying, skittering across the wooden floor to disappear beneath Emma's father's desk. The attack lasted maybe 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds changed everything. Marcus spun toward the noise, his gun swinging away from Emma's head for just an instant, long enough for her to throw herself sideways, breaking free of his grip and diving toward the floor. "Shadow, stop!" she screamed, even as she rolled away from Marcus's reaching hands. The wolf dog released Jake immediately, responding to her command with the discipline that had been drilled into him since puppyhood. But the damage was done. Jake lay crumpled against the fallen books, his left arm twisted at an unnatural angle, blood streaming from deep gashes where Shadow's claws had found purchase on his chest and shoulder. Marcus swung his gun between Emma and Shadow, his face a mask of rage and desperation. "You little bitch! You trained that monster to attack on command!" "No," Emma gasped from where she lay on the floor. "He was protecting me. You had a gun to my head." Outside, Walt's voice had changed from concern to alarm. "Emma, I heard screaming. I'm calling the sheriff right now." The sound of Walt fumbling with his cell phone was audible through the thin cabin walls, and Emma knew that Marcus could hear it too. The older man's face had gone completely white, his eyes darting between the bleeding Jake, the snarling Shadow, and the windows where Walt's silhouette was visible on the porch. "This is all fucked," Jake moaned from his position on the floor. Blood was soaking through his shirt, and his broken arm hung useless at his side. "We gotta go, Marcus. We gotta go right now." But Marcus wasn't listening. Something had snapped in him when Shadow attacked, some final thread of rationality or self-control. Emma could see it in his eyes. The look of a man who had crossed a line he couldn't uncross, who had lost everything and now had nothing left to lose. He raised his gun, and Emma knew with crystal clarity that he intended to kill her, Shadow, and probably Walt too. 3 murders to cover up a robbery gone wrong, 3 lives ended because Billy Chen had given him bad information about an insurance payout. "Marcus, no," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It doesn't have to be like this. You can still walk away." "No," Marcus replied, his voice eerily calm. "I really can't." Outside, they could hear Walt's panicked voice talking to the 911 dispatcher, reporting screaming and possible violence at the Hartwell cabin. Help was coming, but Emma knew it wouldn't arrive in time. Shadow crouched between Emma and Marcus, every line of his body radiating lethal intent. His ice-blue eyes never left the gun in Marcus's hand, and Emma realized that her beloved companion was preparing to sacrifice himself to save her life. The 3 of them, girl, wolf dog, and desperate criminal, faced each other in the ruins of her father's study, while an old man outside tried frantically to save them all. Time stretched like taffy in the moments before Marcus pulled the trigger. Emma could see his finger beginning to tighten, could see the calculation in his eyes as he chose between targeting her or Shadow first. The mathematics of murder, cold and precise. But in that crystalline instant before violence erupted, something unexpected happened. Walt Patterson, 73 years old and arthritic, kicked in the front door with a force that shook the entire cabin. "Emma!" His voice boomed through the house, carrying 30 years of military training that most people had forgotten he possessed. "Where are you, girl?" Marcus hesitated, his attention fractured between the immediate threats in the room and this new variable crashing through his carefully laid plans. That hesitation cost him everything. Shadow didn't hesitate. With Marcus's focus divided and his gun no longer pointed directly at Emma, the wolf dog saw his opportunity and took it with predatory precision. He launched himself not at Marcus's body, but at his gun hand, jaws closing around the wrist with enough force to shatter bone. Marcus screamed as the pistol went flying, his finger reflexively jerking the trigger and sending a wild shot into the ceiling. Plaster rained down as he fell backward, Shadow's weight driving him to the floor, while those powerful jaws maintained their grip on his wrist. "Shadow, release!" Emma shouted, scrambling to her feet. The wolf dog immediately let go and backed away, blood on his muzzle but his eyes calm and controlled. He had done exactly what was necessary, no more and no less. Marcus lay on the floor, clutching his mangled wrist, tears of pain and rage streaming down his face. Walt appeared in the doorway, and Emma was amazed to see him holding an ancient double-barrel shotgun with the steady hands of someone who knew exactly how to use it. "Well, I'll be damned," Walt said, taking in the scene before him. "Emma, you all right, sweetheart?" "I'm okay," Emma managed, though her voice shook with delayed shock. "Walt, how did you—" 20 years in the Marines doesn't just disappear because you get old," Walt replied grimly. "When I heard that scream and saw your house dark, I knew something was wrong." He kept the shotgun trained on Marcus while glancing at the wounded Jake. "Called it in to Sheriff Davidson. He'll be here in 20 minutes with backup." Marcus tried to sit up, his face gray with pain and blood loss. "You don't understand," he gasped. "That thing is a wolf, a goddamn wild wolf living in this house. She's been lying to everyone." Walt's weathered face didn't change expression. "Son, I've known about Shadow since Emma found him as a pup. Half the county knows. We also know he's never hurt anyone who didn't deserve hurting." "He attacked us," Jake moaned from his position against the bookshelf. "Unprovoked." "You were just breaking into a teenage girl's home in the middle of the night," Walt cut him off. "With guns, after cutting her power and phone lines. Don't insult my intelligence by claiming victim status." Emma moved to Shadow's side, running her hands over him to check for injuries. He leaned into her touch, and she could feel the tension gradually leaving his muscles as the immediate danger passed. But she knew their troubles were far from over. "Walt," she said quietly, "when the sheriff gets here, they're going to want to take Shadow. This is exactly the kind of incident that will give them grounds to have him destroyed." Walt nodded grimly. "I've been thinking about that since I called it in. Emma, there's something you need to know about tonight, about why these men came here." He kept the shotgun trained on Marcus but addressed Emma directly. "I did some asking around after I heard the 911 call. Seems Billy Chen's been running his mouth about your family's supposed wealth, telling anyone who'd listen about insurance payouts and hidden money. These boys here weren't the only ones interested." Emma felt her stomach drop. "You mean there could be others?" "Could be. Which means even if we get through tonight, you might not be safe here anymore." Marcus laughed bitterly from the floor. "You think this ends with us? Billy owes money to some very bad people. They'll keep coming until they find what they're looking for, or until they're convinced there's nothing here to find." "Then we make sure they're convinced," Walt said firmly. "Emma, I know this is your family home, but you might need to consider other options, at least until this blows over." The sound of sirens began to echo through the mountain valley, growing stronger by the moment. Emma felt a mixture of relief and dread. Help was arriving, but so was the moment of reckoning. Everything would change after tonight. Shadow pressed against her leg and she buried her fingers in his thick fur. Whatever came next, they would face it together. But as she looked around her father's destroyed study, books scattered everywhere, blood on the floor, her family's precious belongings stolen or damaged, she understood that her old life was ending. "There's something else," Walt said, his voice gentler now. "Your grandfather called me yesterday. His treatment went better than expected. He's being discharged tomorrow." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "He's coming home?" "He is. And when he gets here, he's going to find out about all of this. About Shadow, about the break-in, about you living alone up here." Walt's expression was kind but serious. "Might be time for some honest conversations about the future." The sirens were very close now, and they could see the red and blue lights beginning to strobe through the trees. Marcus had lost consciousness from blood loss and pain, while Jake continued to moan softly about his injuries. "Emma," Walt said urgently, "when Sheriff Davidson gets here, you tell him exactly what happened. Don't try to protect anyone or minimize anything. These men broke into your home and threatened your life. Shadow defended you, nothing more and nothing less." "But the county regulations—" "Let me worry about regulations," Walt interrupted. "I've got some influence in this community, and there are ways to handle situations like this. The important thing is that you and Shadow survive this night and whatever comes after." The first patrol car rounded the bend in the driveway, its headlights flooding the cabin with harsh white light. Emma took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. She was 17 years old, an orphan living alone in the wilderness with a wolf dog that most people considered dangerous. She had been robbed, threatened, and traumatized. But she was alive. Shadow was alive, and somehow, against all odds, they had survived. As Sheriff Davidson's boots echoed on the front porch, Emma made herself a promise. Whatever happened next, investigations, hearings, bureaucratic challenges, she would not let them separate her from Shadow. He had saved her life tonight, but more than that, he was her family. The last connection to her parents and the life they had built together in this remote mountain sanctuary. The door opened, and Sheriff Davidson stepped into the chaos that had once been her father's study. His expression was grim as he took in the wounded men, the blood, and the massive wolf dog standing protectively beside the teenage girl. "Well, Emma," he said quietly, "looks like we have quite a situation here." "Yes, sir," Emma replied, her voice steady despite everything. "But it's not what you might think." 3 months later, Emma stood in the same study where her life had nearly ended, but everything was different now. The bullet hole in the ceiling had been patched and painted over. New books filled the shelves where others had been damaged beyond repair. Most importantly, the room no longer felt haunted by violence. It had reclaimed its identity as a place of learning and discovery. Sheriff Davidson sat across from her at the restored desk, but this wasn't an interrogation. Today, he was delivering news that would change her life forever. "The county board voted unanimously," he said, sliding an official document across the polished wood surface. "Shadow has been officially classified as a therapeutic companion animal rather than a wild predator. The designation comes with strict conditions, but it means he can stay with you legally." Emma's hands trembled as she picked up the paperwork. After 3 months of hearings, evaluations, and bureaucratic wrangling, she had almost given up hope. The night of the break-in had triggered a cascade of investigations. Animal control, child services, wildlife management, even the FBI due to the interstate nature of Marcus's criminal activities. "What changed their minds?" she asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Several things," Davidson replied with a slight smile. Walt Patterson's testimony carried significant weight. So did the character statements from Dr. Martinez at the Veterinary College and Professor Williams at the university. But honestly, what sealed it was the psychological evaluation report. Emma nodded, remembering the grueling weeks of assessments that followed the attack. Both she and Shadow had been subjected to extensive evaluation by animal behaviorists, psychologists, and trauma specialists. The process had been exhausting, but apparently effective. Dr. Rebecca Santos made a compelling case, Davidson continued. Her report documented Shadow's exceptional emotional intelligence, his lack of aggressive tendencies toward non-threatening humans, and most importantly, the therapeutic benefit he provides to you as a trauma survivor. The board couldn't ignore professional testimony like that. Through the window, Emma could see Shadow in the newly expanded enclosure that her grandfather had built upon his return from the hospital. The space was 4 times larger than the original pen, complete with natural obstacles, a small creek, and enough room for a wolf dog to run and play. Shadow wasn't imprisoned there. The gate stood open most of the time. but it provided a secure space when visitors or officials needed reassurance about public safety. "There's more," Davidson added, his tone becoming more serious. "Marcus Kellerman pled guilty to all charges last week. Armed robbery, breaking and entering, assault with a deadly weapon, criminal threatening. He's looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison." Emma felt a complex mix of emotions at this news. She couldn't deny a certain satisfaction in seeing justice served, but she'd also learned enough about Marcus's background to feel a measure of sympathy for the broken man who had terrorized her that night. "What about his PTSD?" she asked. "Is he getting treatment?" Davidson's expression softened with approval. "You're asking the right questions, Emma. Yes, part of his plea agreement includes mandatory psychological treatment. His attorney made a compelling case about untreated combat trauma contributing to his criminal behavior. It doesn't excuse what he did, but it might help prevent him from hurting anyone else in the future." The front door opened, and Emma heard her grandfather's familiar footsteps in the hallway. Samuel Hartwell moved more slowly since his heart surgery, but his spirit remained as strong as ever. He appeared in the doorway carrying a tray with 3 mugs of coffee and his characteristic gentle smile. "Sheriff, good to see you," Samuel said, setting down the tray. "I trust you're bringing Emma good news." "The best," Davidson confirmed, raising his mug in a mock toast. "Shadow gets to stay, and Emma gets to continue her remarkable work." Over the past 3 months, while lawyers and bureaucrats debated Shadow's fate, Emma had channeled her energy into something constructive. Working with Dr. Santos in several veterinary colleges, she had developed a program using Shadow as a therapy animal for other trauma survivors. Children who had been attacked by dogs found comfort in Shadow's gentle presence. Veterans struggling with PTSD connected with his calm, protective energy. Even some law enforcement officers dealing with job-related stress had benefited from interaction with the remarkable wolf dog. "Speaking of work," Samuel said, settling into his favorite chair, "tell the sheriff about the scholarship news." Emma felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment and pride. "It's not official yet." "Don't be modest," Samuel chided. "Sheriff, Emma has been accepted to Colorado State University's veterinary program with a full academic scholarship. They were impressed not only with her grades but with her real-world experience in animal behavior and trauma response." Davidson's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Emma? That's incredible. Your parents would be so proud." The mention of her parents brought the familiar ache to Emma's chest, but it was no longer the sharp pain of fresh grief. Time and healing had transformed it into something more manageable, a bittersweet reminder of love and loss that would always be part of her story. "There's one more piece of good news," Samuel said, reaching for another official-looking document. "The insurance company finally settled the disputed claim. It seems our attorney was more persistent than their legal team." Emma raised an eyebrow in surprise. The insurance battle had been ongoing since her parents' death, with the company initially claiming that her father's decision to fly in marginal weather conditions voided their policy. It had been a source of constant stress and financial uncertainty. "How much?" she asked hesitantly. "Enough to pay for veterinary school without the scholarship, though you're keeping the scholarship anyway," Samuel replied with satisfaction. "Enough to properly maintain this property as a wildlife research station. And enough to establish the James and Sarah Hartwell Foundation for Wildlife Conservation." Emma felt tears prick at her eyes. A foundation in her parents' name. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for. "But here's the interesting part," Samuel continued. "The foundation has already received its first major donation from an unexpected source." "Marcus Kellerman," Davidson said quietly. "Before his sentencing, he liquidated his remaining assets and asked his attorney to arrange the donation. He wanted to do something positive with the money he'd stolen from other victims over the years." Emma sat in stunned silence. The man who had terrorized her, who had come so close to destroying everything she loved, had found a way to contribute to her parents' legacy. It was a gesture of redemption that she never could have anticipated. "There's a letter," Davidson added, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "He wanted you to have it." With trembling fingers, Emma opened the envelope and read the handwritten note inside. "Emma, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. What I did to you was unforgivable. But I wanted you to know that meeting you and Shadow changed something in me. You showed me what real strength looks like, not the kind that comes from violence and intimidation, but the kind that comes from love and loyalty and refusing to give up even when everything seems lost. I hope the money helps you continue your parents' work. The world needs more people like them and like you. Marcus." Emma folded the letter carefully and set it aside. She would need time to process the complex emotions it stirred, but for now, she was content to sit with her grandfather and Sheriff Davidson, drinking coffee and planning for a future that finally seemed bright with possibility. Shadow appeared at the open door, his ice-blue eyes scanning the room before settling on Emma with unmistakable devotion. She gestured to him, and he padded over to rest his massive head on her knee. "You know," Davidson said, watching the interaction with obvious affection, "I used to think keeping a wolf dog was the most dangerous thing a person could do. Now I think letting you two get separated would have been the real tragedy." Outside, the Montana sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, and Emma felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She had survived loss, trauma, and bureaucratic battles. She had her family, both the grandfather who loved her and the loyal companion who had risked everything to protect her. Most importantly, she had found her purpose. The Hartwell name would continue to stand for wildlife conservation, scientific research, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and the natural world. As Shadow's warm weight settled more comfortably against her leg, Emma smiled and began planning for tomorrow. Sometimes the most profound bonds in life come not from blood or marriage, but from shared survival and unconditional loyalty. Emma's story reminds us that family isn't always who we're born with. Sometimes it's who chooses to stand by us when the world turns dark. At 17, facing armed intruders alone, she discovered what so many of us learn too late: that love isn't just a feeling, it's a decision to protect what matters most, even when the cost seems unbearable. Shadow's fierce devotion to Emma mirrors the kind of loyalty we all crave, someone who sees our worth when we can't see it ourselves, someone who refuses to abandon us even when fear would be justified. Her grandfather's return, Walt's courage, even Marcus's final gesture of redemption, these moments show us that healing is possible at any age, that second chances exist even after the worst betrayals. As we navigate our own later chapters, Emma's courage challenges us to ask, who are the shadows in our lives? The loyal souls who've earned our protection? And more importantly, whose lives are we enriching with our own fierce, unconditional love? What unexpected friendship or bond has surprised you with its strength over the years? How do you show loyalty to those who matter most in your life? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how love has transformed your world.